Chapter 1. Dr. Sarah Chin had built her career on the fundamental principle that there was a rational explanation for everything. As she pulled her rental car into the circular drive of what the probate lawyer had called the Vellum estate, she was already mentally cataloging the psychological factors that would make a reasonable person believe this place was haunted. Isolation, for one. The manor sat at the end of a winding dirt road, surrounded by overgrown hedges that blocked any view of neighboring properties. The late October afternoon cast long shadows across the Victorian facade, creating dramatic contrasts that the human eye would naturally interpret as faces or figures. Add in the emotional weight of inherited property, the power of suggestion from local folklore, and the subliminal anxiety of financial responsibility, and you had a perfect recipe for paranormal delusions. Sarah parked and consulted her notes. According to genealogical records, she was a third cousin twice removed to one Silas Vellum, a wallpaper designer who had died intestate in 1891. The property had passed through a series of distant relatives, none of whom had lived in it for more than a few years. The lawyer had seemed almost relieved to transfer the deed, though Sarah attributed that to the obvious maintenance issues, peeling paint, sagging shutters, and what appeared to be significant foundation settling. She grabbed her laptop bag and digital camera. If nothing else, this would make an interesting case study for her. Psychology of inherited trauma. Research. Her colleagues at the university would find it amusing that the woman who had debunked the Riverside Psychiatric Hospital, ghost sightings, had inherited what locals apparently considered a genuinely haunted house. The front door key turned with surprising ease, and Sarah stepped into a foyer that took her breath away. Whatever else could be said about Silas Vellum, the man had had exquisite taste. The wallpaper was extraordinary, an intricate pattern of deep burgundy and gold that seemed to shift subtly in the changing light from the doorway. Botanical motifs intertwined with geometric designs in a way that was both classical and somehow unsettling. Sarah set down her bags and pulled out her camera. This was exactly the kind of elaborate Victorian design that would create optical illusions. The human brain, always seeking patterns and faces, would project consciousness onto inanimate objects. She took several shots from different angles, making notes about lighting conditions and viewing distances. Fascinating example of pareidolia potential, she murmured into her phone's voice recorder. Complex patterns, dramatic lighting, high emotional context. Perfect storm for false perception of movement or faces. She moved through the ground floor methodically, documenting each room. The parlor featured a delicate pattern of climbing roses that seemed almost to rustle in her peripheral vision, clearly a subtle wallpaper texture catching air currents from her movement. The dining room's geometric designs in forest green and silver created a pleasant vertigo effect, probably due to the precise mathematical repetition that could trigger mild vestibular responses. But it was the library that made her pause. The wallpaper here was different, darker, more complex. Deep navy blue with an almost paisley-like pattern in gold thread that seemed to have actual depth. Sarah found herself staring at it longer than was professionally necessary. There was something about the way the golden swirls connected that reminded her of neural pathways, she said aloud, and laughed at herself. Now I'm seeing my own field of expertise in wallpaper. Classic projection. She took several photographs, then sat in the leather chair by the window to make notes. The afternoon light slanted through dirty glass, creating shifting patterns on the opposite wall. Sarah opened her laptop and began typing. Day 1 Initial observations. Property shows clear signs of long-term vacancy but structurally sound. Wallpaper throughout is exceptionally well preserved for 130+ years, suggesting either recent restoration or unusually high-quality materials and installation. Patterns are complex enough to create periodolic responses in susceptible individuals. Note: investigate local folklore regarding specific rooms or phenomena. May provide insight into how suggestion operates in inherited property scenarios. Asterisk. A sound from upstairs made her look up. Settling house, obviously, the kind of creaking that old wooden structures made as temperature and humidity changed throughout the day. But there was something rhythmic about it, almost like footsteps. Sarah closed her laptop with a snap. Day 1 and I'm already anthropomorphizing house sounds, she muttered. This is going to be a more interesting psychological case study than I thought. She climbed the main staircase, noting how each step produced its own distinctive creak. The sound she'd heard could easily have been the wood adjusting to the slight increase in temperature from her presence, and the open front door. The hallway upstairs was dimmer, lit only by windows at either end, and the wallpaper pattern here was more subdued, a soft gray with barely visible botanical elements. Sarah counted 4 bedrooms and a bathroom, each with its own distinct wallpaper pattern. The master bedroom featured an elaborate damask design in gold and cream that must have been breathtaking when new. Even now, faded and slightly water-stained in one corner, it retained an almost regal elegance. She was photographing the water damage when she noticed something odd about the pattern. In the stained area, the damask design seemed different. More organic somehow, as if the water had caused the underlying pattern to show through. Sarah moved closer, adjusting her camera's macro setting. Through the viewfinder, the stained section looked almost like a face, a woman's face, with long hair and what might have been an expression of profound sadness. Sarah lowered the camera and looked directly at the wall. Just water stains and faded wallpaper. She raised the camera again. There it was, unmistakably a human face embedded in the pattern. Excellent example of pareidolia enhancement through photographic framing, Sarah said, though her voice sounded less confident than usual. She took several shots, making careful notes about lighting angles and camera settings. This would make a perfect illustration for her next lecture on how technology could amplify the brain's pattern-seeking behavior. The second bedroom was clearly a child's room, with cheerful yellow wallpaper decorated with nursery rhyme characters. But as Sarah documented the space, she began to feel increasingly uncomfortable. The cartoon figures seemed to be watching her, their painted eyes following her movement around the room. Psychological note, she thought, childhood associations with being watched, combined with guilt over disturbing a deceased child's space. Classic projection of parental anxiety onto environmental cues, But when she turned to leave, she could have sworn she heard something, the faintest whisper, like a child calling for help. Sarah stopped in the doorway, her rational mind warring with a primitive unease she hadn't felt since childhood. She turned back to the room and spoke aloud, partly to test the acoustics and partly to reassert her scientific detachment. If there are any restless spirits here, she said with deliberate irony, I'm Dr. Sarah Chin, and I'm here to document the psychological mechanisms that make people think you exist. The silence that followed seemed almost offended. Chapter 2. Sarah spent her first night in the Manor's master bedroom, partly for practical reasons. It had the best mattress and least musty smell, and partly as a psychological experiment. If she was going to study the effects of suggestion and environmental factors on perception, she needed to experience them firsthand. She'd brought an air mattress and sleeping bag from home, along with a small arsenal of recording equipment that would have impressed a ghost hunter and amused her colleagues in equal measure. Digital thermometers, electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, and high-sensitivity audio recorders were positioned throughout the room. If this house was going to play tricks on her perception, she was going to document every environmental variable that might explain them. The EMF detector registered consistent low-level readings, probably from old electrical wiring that wasn't properly shielded. The temperature sensors showed the expected variations as the house cooled after sunset, a few degrees difference between the corners and center of the room, creating air currents that could easily be mistaken for supernatural cold spots. Sarah settled into her sleeping bag with a satisfied smile. Already, she was building a compelling case study about how even trained scientists could be influenced by environmental factors and expectation. Her iPhone showed 3 bars of signal, and she tested the Wi-Fi, strong enough for her to maintain contact with the outside world and upload her findings in real time. She was just drifting off to sleep when the whispering started. At first, she thought it was wind through the old window frames. but as she listened more carefully, the sounds resolved into something disturbingly like voices, multiple voices, speaking in hushed, urgent tones just beyond the threshold of comprehension. Sarah reached for her audio recorder without sitting up, trying not to disturb whatever acoustic phenomenon was creating the effect. The recording levels showed she was definitely picking up sound, but when she played it back through her earbuds, all she heard was silence. Interesting, she thought. Auditory hallucination triggered by unfamiliar environment and sleep state transition. The brain fills in patterns when confronted with ambiguous sensory data. But even as she rationalized the experience, the whispering continued. And now it seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, specifically from the areas where the damask wallpaper was most elaborate. Sarah sat up and turned on her flashlight. The golden pattern seemed to shift in the moving light, creating the illusion of depth and movement. She played the beam slowly across the wall, watching how the raised elements of the pattern created shadows that appeared to writhe and flow. Classic example of pattern movement illusion, she murmured, but her voice sounded small in the large room. That's when she noticed that one section of wallpaper, the area near the water stain where she'd seen the face-like pattern, was moving in a way that couldn't be explained by shifting light. The damask swirls were actually rearranging themselves, forming new patterns that resolved briefly into recognizable shapes before flowing back into abstract design. Sarah blinked hard and rubbed her eyes. When she looked again, the wallpaper was perfectly still. Sleep deprivation hallucination, she diagnosed herself. Combined with fixation on previously observed periidolic patterns. Textbook case, But she spent the rest of the night sitting up with her back against the far wall, all her recording equipment running, watching the wallpaper that refused to move again while she was looking directly at it. Chapter 3. The Millbrook Public Library was a small, underfunded building that Sarah reached after a 20-minute drive through countryside that was beautiful in the way that suggested it had been bypassed by economic development. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and suspicious eyes, clearly recognized the address when Sarah asked about local history resources. "You're staying out at the old Vellum place," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "I inherited it," Sarah explained. "I'm doing some research into the family history." The librarian's expression shifted subtly, not exactly sympathy, but something close to it. "You might want to talk to Mrs. Henley. She's our local history expert, and her family's been in the area since before the manor was built." Mrs. Henley turned out to be a tiny woman in her 80s with sharp blue eyes and an encyclopedic knowledge of every family that had ever lived within 30 miles of Millbrook. She seemed delighted to have someone to talk to about the Vellum family, though her delight was tinged with something that might have been concern. "Oh, Silas Vellum," she said, settling into a chair across from Sarah with a thick folder of photocopied documents and newspaper clippings. "Now there's a family with a story. Your great-great-great-uncle, wasn't he?" "Something like that," Sarah said, pulling out her notebook. "The genealogy gets a bit complicated. Well, Silas was quite the artist in his day. His wallpapers were sought after all over New England. Very exclusive, very expensive. People said he used techniques that nobody else could duplicate." Mrs. Henley spread out several newspaper clippings from the 1880s. Sarah photographed each one, noting headlines like, "Vellum Designs Grace Governor's Mansion," and "Local Artisan Creates Living Wallpapers." "Living wallpapers?" Sarah asked. "Oh, that was just the way they talked back then. Dramatic, you know. But people did say there was something special about his work. The pattern seemed to, well, you'll think an old woman is being foolish. Please, I'm very interested in how folklore develops around local figures." Mrs. Henley leaned forward conspiratorially. "They said the patterns moved. Not obviously, you understand, but if you lived with them long enough, you'd start to notice things. Faces appearing and disappearing, designs that seemed different each time you looked at them." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the library's aggressive air conditioning. Did anyone ever try to explain this phenomenon? Well, there were rumors. Mrs. Henley's voice dropped even lower. People said Silas used unusual materials in his inks and adhesives. There were stories about him visiting the poorhouse, the asylum, even the morgue. Always with that leather satchel of his, always taking notes. She pulled out a photograph, a formal portrait of a man in his 40s with intense dark eyes and an elaborate mustache. Even in the sepia tones of 19th century photography, there was something unsettling about his gaze. This is Silas? Sarah asked. Taken just a few years before he died. Notice anything familiar about the eyes? Sarah studied the photograph and felt her stomach tighten. The shape of the eyes, the set of the brows, she'd seen those features in her own mirror every morning for 34 years. Family resemblance, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Indeed. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. Mrs. Henley pulled out a police report, handwritten in faded ink. Silas died under mysterious circumstances in 1891. Found dead in his workshop in the Manor cellar, surrounded by rolls of unfinished wallpaper. No signs of violence, no obvious cause of death. The coroner ruled it a heart attack, but several people who were at the scene said the wallpaper in the workshop was still moving when they found the body. Writhing, one witness said, like it was trying to free itself from the walls. Sarah photographed the police report, her hand steadier than her pulse. What happened to his workshop? Oh, it's still there, as far as I know. The family sealed it up after he died, nailed the doors shut, and never spoke of it again. Subsequent owners of the manor have left it alone. There are stories about people who tried to break in over the years, but... She shrugged. Well, you know how stories grow. What kind of stories? Mrs. Henley hesitated. People who went down there and came back, changed. Talking about voices in the walls, claiming they could see faces in every pattern they looked at. Most folks just figured they'd been drinking too much, but there were enough incidents that people learned to stay away. Sarah spent another hour copying documents and taking notes, but her mind kept returning to the sealed workshop. As a psychologist, she knew that prohibition and mystery were powerful psychological amplifiers. Tell someone they can't go somewhere, especially somewhere associated with death and local folklore, and their imagination would populate it with horrors far more vivid than reality. But as a scientist, she was intensely curious about what physical evidence might remain of Silas Vellum's work. If he had indeed used unusual materials or techniques, studying them might provide valuable insight into how local legends developed around historical figures. And as a woman who had spent the previous night listening to whispers that came from wallpaper that moved when she wasn't looking directly at it, she was beginning to suspect that her rational explanations might not be adequate to explain what was happening at Vellum Manor. Chapter 4. Sarah returned to the manor as the sun was setting, her head full of 19th century newspaper accounts, and her digital camera full of historical documents. She'd stopped at a hardware store in town and purchased a crowbar, a high-powered flashlight, and a dust mask. If she was going to investigate Silas Vellum's sealed workshop, she was going to do it properly. The cellar entrance was exactly where Mrs. Henley had said it would be, through the kitchen, down a narrow staircase that creaked ominously under Sarah's weight. The basement was larger than she'd expected, with stone walls that retained a chill even in the warm October evening. Most of the space was empty except for the detritus of more than a century, broken furniture, moldering boxes, and the skeletal remains of what had once been a wine rack. But at the far end of the cellar, she found what she was looking for, a heavy wooden door secured with multiple layers of boards nailed across the frame. Someone had taken great care to ensure this room stayed closed. Sarah set up her equipment, cameras, lights, an air quality monitor, before beginning the careful work of removing the boards. The nails were old and rusted, but the wood had dried and shrunk over the decades, making it easier to pry loose than she'd expected. The last board came free with a screech of protesting metal, and Sarah found herself facing a door that looked perfectly ordinary except for the deep scratches that scored its inner surface, as if something had been trying to claw its way out. She turned the handle and pushed the door open. The smell hit her first, not the expected mustiness of a long-closed room, but something organic and unsettling, like ink mixed with something that might once have been alive. Her flashlight beam revealed a workshop that looked as if Silas Vellum had just stepped out for lunch. Rolls of wallpaper stood against the walls, their patterns visible even in the dim light. A massive wooden table dominated the center of the room, its surface stained with dark marks that could have been ink, or something less pleasant. Glass bottles lined wooden shelves, filled with substances that Sarah couldn't identify, some liquid, some powder, all the color of dried blood or old bones. But it was the walls themselves that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Every surface was covered with wallpaper, but not in any pattern she recognized from the rooms above. These designs were wrong somehow, organic and geometric at the same time, creating optical illusions that made her eyes water when she tried to focus on them. And unlike the faded patterns upstairs, these looked as fresh as if they'd been hung yesterday. Sarah moved deeper into the room, her camera clicking steadily. This was extraordinary, a perfectly preserved 19th-century artisan's workshop, complete with original materials and work samples. The Historical Society would be fascinated. But as she documented the space, she began to notice details that chilled her professional enthusiasm. The bottles on the shelves weren't just filled with pigments and adhesives. Some contained what looked suspiciously like organic matter, hair, perhaps, or dry tissue of some kind. One bottle held what appeared to be teeth, yellowed with age but still recognizably human. A leather-bound ledger lay open on the work table, its pages covered with Silas's spidery handwriting. Sarah leaned closer to read. October 12, 1891. The Marchmont Commission progresses well. Mrs. M's grief over her stillborn child provides excellent binding properties for the nursery roses. Must remember to collect the tears while they are still fresh. Dried sorrow lacks the necessary adhesive qualities. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned the page. October 15th. Young Timothy from the asylum expired today. His fear in the final moments was quite intense, perfect for the geometric patterns in the study. The screaming enhances the visual complexity remarkably. The entries went on for pages, each one describing in clinical detail how Silas harvested human emotions, suffering, and apparently human remains to incorporate into his wallpaper designs. Sarah photographed each page, her scientific training warring with growing horror. This wasn't just folklore or local superstition. These were the meticulous records of someone who had discovered a way to literally bind human consciousness into decorative patterns. As she read, Sarah became aware that the wallpaper surrounding her was beginning to move. Not the subtle shifting she noticed upstairs, but obvious, deliberate motion. Faces were emerging from the patterns, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Men, women, children, all with expressions of terror or anguish that seemed to focus directly on her. One of the bottles on the shelf began to rattle. Then another. Sarah spun around as the entire workshop came alive, papers rustling without any breeze, bottles clinking together, and through it all, the sound of voices. Not whispers this time, but actual voices, calling out in languages she didn't recognize, pleading in tones that transcended linguistic barriers. The faces in the wallpaper were moving now, pressing outward as if trying to break through the paper that held them. Some had mouths that opened and closed in silent screams. Others reached with arms that stretched impossibly from two-dimensional space. Sarah stumbled backward toward the door, her scientific detachment finally overwhelmed by primal terror. But as she reached the threshold, one voice cut through the chaos, clear, articulate, and speaking directly to her. Sarah Vellum. The voice was cultured, with the accent of educated 19th-century New England. How delightful to finally meet a descendant with the proper sensitivities. She turned to see a figure materializing in the wallpaper directly behind Silas's work table, the man from the photograph, his intense dark eyes now glowing with an unnatural light. Great-great-great-uncle Silas, I presume? Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. The figure smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp for human anatomy. Indeed. And you, my dear, are going to help me complete my masterpiece. Chapter 5. Sarah ran. Every instinct screamed at her to flee the workshop, the manor, possibly the entire state of Connecticut. But even as she stumbled up the cellar stairs, her laptop bag clutched against her chest, the rational part of her mind was already working to process what she'd experienced. Mass hallucination triggered by environmental factors, she told herself, even as the voices from the workshop continued to call after her. Carbon monoxide from old furnace, combined with suggestion from historical documents, and sleep deprivation. She burst through the kitchen door, and didn't stop running until she reached her car. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the keys, and she was halfway down the drive before she realized she was still wearing the dust mask from her cellar exploration. Sarah drove to the nearest gas station, a fluorescent-lit sanctuary of normalcy where she sat in her car and tried to catalog what she'd actually experienced versus what her compromised mental state might have fabricated. The photographs on her camera would tell the story. Either she'd documented a remarkable historical discovery, or she'd taken pictures of empty walls while hallucinating elaborate supernatural phenomena. But when she reviewed the images on her camera's LCD screen, her scientific skepticism took another devastating blow. The workshop was there, exactly as she'd seen it. Silas's ledger was clearly visible, his handwriting legible even in the low-resolution preview. And in several shots, the faces in the wallpaper were unmistakably present, not periodolic suggestions or photographic artifacts, but actual human faces embedded in the decorative patterns. In the last photo she'd taken, just before fleeing, a figure that looked exactly like the man from Mrs. Henley's historical photograph stood clearly visible in the wallpaper behind the work table. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her department chair. "How's the sabbatical research going? Looking forward to your presentation on inherited trauma narratives." She stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Fascinating material. May need to extend field work." Chapter 6. Sarah checked into the Millbrook Inn, a bed and breakfast that looked like it had been decorated by someone with strong opinions about floral patterns but no apparent connection to supernatural horrors. She spread her research materials across the small desk in her room and tried to approach the situation with the methodical analysis that had served her throughout her academic career. Hypothesis 1: Environmental contamination. The manor had been unoccupied for extended periods. Mold, chemical residues from old building materials, or gas leaks could cause hallucinations that seemed remarkably consistent and detailed. Hypothesis 2: Psychological breakdown. The stress of inheriting property, combined with immersion in local folklore and disturbing historical documents, could trigger dissociative episodes or acute psychotic symptoms. Hypothesis 3: Elaborate hoax. Someone with access to the property and knowledge of the family history could be staging supernatural phenomena for unknown motives. Hypothesis 4. Sarah stared at the blank line in her notebook for a long time before writing. The phenomena are genuine supernatural manifestations. Even typing those words felt like professional suicide. But as she reviewed her documentation, photographs, audio recordings, historical research, she couldn't ignore the mounting evidence that something impossible was happening at Vellum Manor. Her laptop chimed with an email from her research assistant back at the university. "Dr. Chen, found some interesting references to your Vellum family research. Apparently Silas Vellum's wallpaper designs were mentioned in several 19th century psychological journals. Attached PDFs might be relevant to your inherited trauma project." Sarah opened the attachments with growing unease. The first was from the American Journal of Alienism and Mental Hygiene, 1892. "We have documented 17 cases of individuals who developed acute psychological symptoms after prolonged exposure to wallpaper designs created by the late artisan Silas Vellum. Patients report persistent auditory and visual hallucinations, often describing voices from the walls and claiming to see human faces and decorative patterns. Of particular concern is the remarkable consistency of these reports across different patients who had no contact with each other." The second document was from the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, 1893. Following our previous correspondence regarding the vellum wallpaper cases, I must report a disturbing development. 3 of the affected patients have died under circumstances that can only be described as bizarre. In each case, family members found the deceased standing before walls decorated with vellum patterns, apparently attempting to press themselves into the wallpaper itself. Post-mortem examination revealed no obvious cause of death, though all 3 bodies showed unusual desiccation, as if vital fluids had been somehow extracted. Sarah closed her laptop and walked to the window. The view from her room overlooked Millbrook's main street, where normal people were living normal lives, completely unaware that impossible things were happening just a few miles away. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed her sister's name. "Hey, Rebecca." "Sarah? How's your spooky inheritance? Found any ghosts yet?" The question was meant as a joke, but Sarah found herself hesitating too long before answering. "Actually, I'm finding some fascinating historical material. The family history is more complex than I expected." "Complex how? Are we descended from serial killers or something?" "Or something," Sarah thought. "Just unusual artistic practices. Nothing criminal." They chatted for a few more minutes about family news and Rebecca's kids, but Sarah found it difficult to focus on normalcy when her mind kept returning to faces pressed against wallpaper, reaching out from 2-dimensional space with impossible desperation. After hanging up, she sat on the bed and tried to think through her options rationally. She could leave, pack up her research, drive back to the university, and spend the rest of her sabbatical writing about the psychological effects of inherited property and local folklore. It would make a compelling paper, especially if she focused on her own susceptibility to environmental suggestion. Or she could go back to the manor. Sarah knew she was going back. Despite every rational argument against it, despite her genuine terror of what she'd experienced, she couldn't abandon the people she'd seen in that wallpaper. Because that's what they were, people. Not hallucinations or psychological projections, but actual human beings who had been trapped for more than a century in Silas Vellum's horrific artistic experiment. Chapter 7. Sarah returned to Vellum Manor the next morning armed with equipment that would have made a paranormal investigator envious. She'd driven to Hartford overnight and purchased industrial-grade air filtration masks, electromagnetic field detectors, thermal imaging cameras, and enough battery packs to run everything for 12 hours straight. If she was going to investigate genuine supernatural phenomena, she was going to do it with scientific rigor. The manor felt different in daylight, less oppressive, though no less strange. Sarah moved through the ground floor rooms systematically, taking baseline readings on all her equipment and documenting the wallpaper patterns with high-resolution photography. In the parlor, her thermal camera picked up cold spots that corresponded exactly to areas where the rose pattern was most elaborate. The EMF detector showed spikes near specific sections of wall that seemed to pulse in rhythm with something Sarah couldn't identify. But it was in the dining room that she first made contact with one of the trapped souls. Sarah was photographing the geometric wallpaper pattern when she heard a voice, faint, but clearly audible. "Please help us." She turned toward the sound, and in her peripheral vision, caught a glimpse of a young woman's face emerging from the green and silver pattern. When Sarah looked directly at the spot, there was nothing but wallpaper. "I can hear you," Sarah said, feeling ridiculous but determined to approach this scientifically. "Can you tell me your name?" The response came not as words but as images that seemed to form directly in Sarah's mind. A young woman in 1880s dress, working as a maid in a wealthy household. Tuberculosis. Pain. Fear. And then Silas Vellum appearing at her bedside with his leather satchel, speaking gently as he collected something, tears, breath, perhaps her final moments of consciousness, while she died. "Margaret," Sarah whispered, somehow knowing the name. The cold spot on her thermal camera pulsed brighter, and for just a moment, the wallpaper pattern rearranged itself into the clear outline of a woman reaching toward her. Over the next several hours, Sarah made contact with more of them. William, a businessman who had lost everything in a financial panic and ended his own life, his despair now woven into the study's burgundy and gold stripes. Little Emma, who had died of scarlet fever at age 6, her innocence and terror embedded in the nursery's cheerful yellow pattern. Thomas, a soldier who had never recovered from what he'd seen in the Civil War, his nightmares now part of the library's deep blue paisley. Each contact was different, some communicated through images, others through emotions that flooded Sarah's consciousness, and a few managed actual words that seemed to come from the walls themselves. But they all had one thing in common: they were trapped, slowly fading as their individual consciousness was absorbed into Silas Vellum's growing power. "He feeds on us," came a voice from the master bedroom's damask pattern. "Takes our memories, our emotions, everything that made us who we were. We're becoming part of him." Sarah was documenting this communication when she felt a familiar presence behind her. She turned to find Silas Vellum's figure materializing in the hallway wallpaper, his form more solid than it had been in the workshop. "You're learning quickly," he said, his cultured voice carrying easily through the air. "I wondered if you would have the family sensitivity. So few of our bloodline have been gifted with the sight. What you did to these people," Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "It's monstrous." Silas laughed, a sound like paper rustling. "Monstrous? My dear girl, I created art that transcends the mundane boundaries of life and death. These souls are not imprisoned, they are preserved, transformed into something beautiful and eternal. They're suffering. They are serving a higher purpose. Just as you will." The wallpaper around Silas began to shift and flow, patterns extending outward like reaching arms. Sarah backed away, but she could see similar movements starting in the patterns throughout the hallway. "You see, my dear descendant, the masterpiece I began in 1891 was never completed. I died too soon, before I could gather the final components. But now you're here, with your delicious skepticism and your modern scientific mind. The contrast between rational thought and supernatural reality will create the most exquisite patterns." Sarah ran for the stairs, but the wallpaper was moving everywhere now, reaching, grasping, trying to pull her into the patterns where she would join the dozens of souls already trapped. She made it to the front door just as the foyer's burgundy and gold design began to writhe like living tissue. She burst outside into afternoon sunlight and didn't stop running until she reached her car. Chapter 8. That night, in her room at the Millbrook Inn, Sarah spread out architectural plans of the manor that she'd obtained from the county records office. If she was going to help the trapped souls, she needed to understand exactly what she was dealing with. The blueprints showed that Silas had made extensive modifications to the house during the 1880s, adding the workshop in the cellar, reconfiguring rooms, and installing what the plans labeled as specialized ventilation systems throughout the building. Sarah studied the ventilation diagrams with growing understanding. The house was designed to circulate air in specific patterns that would carry sounds, voices, whispers, even dying breaths, from room to room. Silas hadn't just been collecting human suffering for his wallpaper. He'd turned the entire manor into a kind of resonating chamber that would amplify and preserve the consciousness he'd trapped. Her laptop chimed with an email from Dr. James Mitchell, a colleague in the university's chemistry department. "Sarah, got your request about analyzing historical wallpaper samples. Very intriguing composition. The adhesive contains organic compounds I can't identify, but they seem to have remarkable preservative properties. Even more interesting, spectral analysis shows traces of what appears to be human DNA, integrated into the paper fibers themselves. Where did you find this material? Could be a significant archaeological discovery." Sarah stared at the email for a long time. James's analysis confirmed what she'd begun to suspect. Silas hadn't just used human emotions and suffering in his wallpaper. He'd literally incorporated human biological material into the physical structure of his designs. She opened a new document and began typing. Personal log, day 3. Evidence now conclusively supports supernatural hypothesis. Subject: Silas Vellum developed technique for binding human consciousness into decorative wallpaper using combination of psychological trauma harvesting and biological integration. Estimated 40 to 60 individuals trapped in manor walls, consciousness intact but slowly deteriorating. Immediate concern: Silas himself appears to be gaining strength, possibly by absorbing energy from trapped souls. Physical manifestation becoming more solid with each encounter. Ethical obligation: trapped individuals are suffering and requesting help. Cannot abandon them regardless of personal risk. Problem: unknown how to release souls without also freeing Silas, who clearly intends to complete his masterpiece, using living subjects. Sarah saved the document and closed her laptop. Tomorrow, she would have to go back to the manor one more time. Not just to document the phenomena, but to find a way to free the people who had been trapped there for more than a century. Even if it killed her. Chapter 9. Sarah's final return to Vellum Manor was planned with the precision of a military operation. She'd researched historical methods of wallpaper removal, consulted with a restoration expert about adhesive solvents, and equipped herself with chemical strippers that should theoretically dissolve the bonds holding the patterns to the walls. Her working theory was simple: if the souls were bound into the physical structure of the wallpaper, then removing the paper itself might release them. It was crude, but it was the only approach that made sense given her limited understanding of Silas's methods. She started in the dining room, with Margaret. The chemical stripper worked faster than Sarah had expected. As the green and silver pattern began to dissolve, she could hear Margaret's voice growing stronger, more distinct. "Yes," Margaret whispered as the wallpaper peeled away in long strips. "I can feel freedom." But as Sarah worked, she became aware of movement throughout the rest of the house. Silas was fighting back. The wallpaper in adjacent rooms was writhing violently, and she could hear his voice echoing from every pattern-covered surface. "Stop this immediately! You have no idea what you're unleashing!" Sarah ignored him and continued stripping the dining room walls. As each section came free, she felt a sense of release, not just from Margaret, but from something larger that had been holding the manor in its grip. She was halfway through the room when the first soul broke free. Margaret's form shimmered in the air for a moment, translucent but clearly human, her face no longer twisted with suffering but peaceful, grateful. She mouthed the words, "Thank you," before fading into whatever came after more than a century of imprisonment. One down. Dozens to go. Sarah moved to the parlor next, but as she began working on the rose pattern, Silas appeared in the doorway, not in wallpaper this time, but as a three-dimensional figure that cast an actual shadow. "You're destroying everything I've built," he said, his voice no longer cultured but raw with rage. "Do you have any idea how long it took to perfect the binding process? Long enough to torture innocent people for over 100 years. Sarah replied, not pausing in her work. "They weren't innocent." Silas stepped into the room, and Sarah could feel the temperature drop around him. "They were dying anyway, diseased, insane, worthless. I gave their suffering meaning. Transformed their pain into beauty." Another section of wallpaper came free, and Sarah felt the presence of one of the children, little Emma, finally released into whatever peace awaited beyond the manor's walls. "You're insane," Sarah said. "I'm an artist." Silas reached toward her with hands that weren't quite solid but felt real enough when they closed around her wrist. "And you, my dear descendant, are going to help me complete the work that death interrupted." Sarah felt herself being pulled toward the parlor's remaining wallpaper, could see the rose pattern beginning to open like a mouth, ready to receive her. But in that moment of genuine terror, she finally understood what she had to do. The souls weren't just trapped in individual rooms. They were all connected through the house's modified ventilation system. And Silas's power came from feeding on their combined suffering. If she could free them all at once. Sarah broke free from Silas's grip and ran for the cellar. Chapter 10. The workshop felt different when Sarah burst through the door, not empty and oppressive, but crowded with the presence of dozens of trapped souls. They were all there, pressed against the wallpaper patterns that covered every surface, watching her with desperate hope. "Is there a way to release everyone at once?" Sarah called out to the assembled consciousness. The response came as a chorus of voices, images, and emotions that nearly overwhelmed her. But the message was clear: yes, there was a way. Silas's master pattern, the centerpiece that connected all the other designs throughout the house, was here in the workshop. If she could destroy it. Sarah found the pattern they meant, a massive design that covered the entire back wall of the workshop, more complex and disturbing than anything she'd seen upstairs. It seemed to pulse with its own light, and as she looked at it, she could see elements from every other pattern in the house woven into its structure. This was Silas's masterpiece, not just a single wallpaper design, but a supernatural mandala that bound together the consciousness of everyone he'd trapped. Sarah approached it with her chemical stripper, but before she could begin working, Silas appeared behind her. "Don't you dare," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute control. "That pattern represents decades of work, the accumulated suffering of dozens of carefully selected subjects. It's the foundation of everything I've accomplished." "Good," Sarah said, and began applying the chemical solution. The effect was immediate and terrifying. As the master pattern began to dissolve, the entire house shook. Wallpaper was peeling free from walls throughout the manor, and with each strip that fell, Sarah could feel another consciousness breaking free from its century-long imprisonment. But Silas wasn't finished. As his masterpiece disintegrated, he grew more solid, more real, as if the energy being released from the pattern was flowing directly into him. "If you destroy my work," he said, advancing on Sarah with hands that now looked entirely human, "I'll simply start again. With you as my first new subject." Sarah backed against the work table, still spraying chemicals at the dissolving pattern. "The difference is, this time people know what you are. This time there's evidence. Evidence can be destroyed. People can be convinced they imagine things. But art, true art, is eternal." Silas lunged for her, but as his hands closed around Sarah's throat, the last section of the master pattern finally dissolved completely. The workshop exploded with light and sound as dozens of souls burst free simultaneously. Sarah saw them all in that moment, Margaret and little Emma and William and Thomas and all the others, no longer trapped but finally able to move on to whatever came next. But they didn't all leave immediately. Some of them turned toward Silas with expressions that were no longer suffering but righteous anger. A century of imprisonment, of having their pain harvested for someone else's twisted artistic vision, had left them with unfinished business. "No," Silas whispered as the freed souls surrounded him. "No, you can't. I made you beautiful, I gave you purpose." His protests were cut short as the souls he tortured for so long finally had their revenge. Sarah watched as they pulled him into whatever dimension they occupied, carrying him away from the physical world where he could never again harm the living. The workshop fell silent except for Sarah's breathing and the distant sound of wallpaper continuing to fall from walls throughout the manor. She was alone. Chapter 11. The cleanup took 3 days. Sarah documented everything, photographing the workshop before the Historical Society arrived, carefully preserving Silas's ledger and the remaining bottles of his horrific materials, interviewing Mrs. Henley and the other locals about their family stories related to the manor. The wallpaper throughout the house had indeed fallen away completely, leaving bare walls that somehow felt peaceful in a way that the elaborate patterns never had. Sarah found herself able to sleep in the master bedroom without any sense of being watched, and the strange whispers and cold spots that had characterized her first visits were completely gone. Dr. Mitchell's analysis of the wallpaper samples became the cornerstone of a paper that Sarah would eventually publish in the Journal of Anomalous Psychology, carefully framed as a study of how environmental factors and local folklore could create remarkably consistent hallucinations, but with enough detail that other researchers would understand what had really happened. The manor itself presented an interesting dilemma. Sarah couldn't in good conscience sell it to an unsuspecting family, but she also couldn't simply abandon a property that was now, ironically, one of the best preserved examples of Victorian architecture in the region. She decided to donate it to the local historical society, with the workshop converted into a small museum dedicated to 19th-century wallpaper design. Mrs. Henley was delighted to serve as the first curator, and Sarah suspected that the old woman's knowledge of the true history would ensure that visitors never had to experience what Sarah had gone through. The ledger and remaining materials were more problematic. Sarah ultimately donated them to the university's special collections, where they would be available for academic research but safely contained behind climate-controlled security. Chapter 12. 6 months later, Sarah was back in her office at the university, putting the finishing touches on her sabbatical research presentation. Her colleagues had been fascinated by her work on inherited property and psychological suggestion, especially her detailed documentation of how environmental factors could create remarkably consistent supernatural experiences. The presentation went well. Sarah talked about pareidolia, environmental contamination, and the psychological effects of isolation and family history. She showed photographs of the wallpaper patterns and played audio recordings of the voices she'd documented. Everything had a rational explanation, carefully supported by scientific evidence. But during the question period afterward, a graduate student asked the question Sarah had been dreading. Dr. Chen, in your personal opinion, after spending all that time in the allegedly haunted house, do you think there might be phenomena that can't be explained by current psychological or environmental science? Sarah looked out at the audience, her colleagues, her students, people who respected her rational approach to understanding human behavior. She thought about Margaret's peaceful expression as she finally found release, about little Emma's grateful farewell, about the dozens of souls who had suffered for more than a century until someone finally heard their pleas for help. I think, Sarah said carefully, that there are experiences that challenge our current understanding of consciousness and reality. Whether we call them supernatural or simply not yet understood natural phenomena is perhaps less important than approaching them with both scientific rigor and genuine compassion. After the presentation, Sarah drove home to the small house she'd inherited from her grandmother, a simple craftsman bungalow with plain painted walls and no wallpaper anywhere. She made herself dinner and settled into grade papers, content with her quiet, rational, completely normal life. But sometimes, late at night when she was working in her study, Sarah would catch herself listening for whispers that never came. And sometimes she found herself examining the patterns in her grandmother's simple floral curtains, looking for faces that weren't there. She never saw anything supernatural again. But she never stopped believing that consciousness, human consciousness, was far more complex and persistent than most people understood. And whenever she heard about unexplained phenomena or allegedly haunted locations, Sarah remembered the voices that had called to her from Silas Vellum's wallpaper, and she wondered who else might be trapped somewhere, waiting for someone to listen. The Vellum Manor still stands, now operating as a small museum and bed and breakfast. Visitors often comment on how peaceful the restored rooms feel, how the simple painted walls create such a sense of calm after the stresses of modern life. The workshop in the cellar is part of the guided tour, carefully presented as an example of Victorian-era craftsmanship. Mrs. Henley tells visitors about Silas Vellum's innovative techniques and his reputation for creating living wallpapers that seem to move and change with the light. She never mentions the bottles of organic materials that are now safely locked away in the university's archives. She never talks about the souls that were trapped for more than a century, or about the professor who heard their voices and found a way to set them free. But sometimes, when the light hits the empty walls just right, visitors claim they can see faint outlines in the paint, shadows of patterns that might once have been there, now peaceful and still. And Mrs. Henley just smiles and talks about how old houses hold memories in their walls, how the past never completely disappears but sometimes finds new ways to tell its stories. The Vellum Papers, as Sarah's research came to be known, remain in the special collections of the university library. They're available to serious researchers, though most people who read them assume they're an elaborate work of fiction, a psychological thriller dressed up as academic documentation. But occasionally, someone reads Sarah's meticulous notes and photographs, studies Silas's ledger with its horrific recipes, and begins to wonder about other old houses, other families with artistic traditions, other wallpapers that seem to move when you're not looking directly at them. Those people sometimes contact Sarah. They call her office or send careful, hesitant emails asking if she might be available for consultation on what they describe as unusual inherited property situations. Sarah always takes those calls. Because she knows now that consciousness doesn't end with death, That human suffering can be bound into physical objects by those with the knowledge and willingness to do so, and that sometimes the only thing standing between the living and those who would exploit both life and death is someone willing to listen to voices that shouldn't exist. The last entry in Sarah's private research journal, written the day after the Vellum Manor workshop was finally destroyed, reads simply: "They're free now. All of them. But there are other houses, other families, other victims still waiting. The work continues. And it does." The end.